When the war in Iran kicked off, there was some suggestion that the American economy would be relatively insulated from any associated rise in oil prices, thanks to the US's position as the world's biggest oil producer and the related fact that the US doesn't really import any oil from the Middle East anymore. That isn't how things have panned out. According to data published last week, headline inflation came in at 3.8% in April, the highest since May 2023 and the highest in the G7, while the Producer Price Index, which basically tells you how much inflation producers are experiencing and is generally considered a pretty good predictor of future headline inflation, came in at an eye-watering 6%, the highest since December 2022. So in this video, we're going to explain why US inflation has risen further and faster than most people expected, and why things could get quite a lot worse yet. This map shows all of the places Trump has launched military offensives since returning to the White House last year. How did we reach this point? In the latest issue of our magazine, we run through a timeline of Trump's military chaos around the world. That's just some of 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more in too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So we're basically going to split this video into two parts. First, we're going to explain why the US economy is surprisingly exposed to the current energy shock, at least from an inflationary perspective. And then, second, we're going to explain why the US might be more at risk of a prolonged and potentially more severe inflationary episode, even if the energy crisis abates. Hint, this mostly has to do with Trump's growing influence over America's central bank, the Federal Reserve. Anyway, before we get on to that, let's start with the first bit. Broadly speaking, we think the US is surprisingly exposed to the current energy shock for two reasons. The first and simplest reason is that inflation was already running relatively hot in the US, at least compared to most other similarly developed economies. For context, in February of this year, essentially the month before the war kicked off, year-on-year inflation was running at 2.4% in the US. This is both above the Federal Reserve's 2% target and pretty high by international standards. In Germany, for instance, inflation was running at 1.9%, while in France it was just 1%. In fact, the only G7 country with a higher inflation rate than the US going into the war was the UK. And, well, having a more functional economy than the UK is hardly a brag at the moment. Anyway, the second reason that the US is surprisingly exposed to the current energy shock is that the US is actually more dependent on fossil fuels than is often assumed. For context, some commentators have argued that America's position as the world's biggest oil producer means it's effectively insulated from the current energy shock, or at least more so than oil importing countries in Europe and Asia. But this is, well, wrong. While it's true that the rise of fracking and shale oil, which really took off in the 2010s, has indeed turned the US into the world's biggest oil producer, the US economy is just massive and diversified. So what happens in the oil sector isn't really material to the wider economic outlook. This makes the US unlike other big oil producers like Saudi Arabia and Russia, which are far more dependent on oil for both their wider economies and their tax bases. So, while this energy shock has indeed been great for American oil companies, it's been bad for everyone else. And somewhat unsurprisingly, the positive consequences of higher prices for American energy producers are dwarfed by the negative consequences for the rest of the economy, which is actually remarkably exposed to oil shocks. For context, the so-called oil intensity of the US economy, which basically tells you how much oil the economy consumes to produce $1 of GDP, is roughly twice that of the EU. This implies that, contrary to received wisdom, the US economy is actually more exposed to an oil price shock than other countries. This also explains why the US has already seen a far steeper rise in energy prices than other similar economies. For context, year-on-year inflation for energy specifically jumped from 0.5% in February to 12.5% in March, and then an eye-watering 17.9% in April. This is a far steeper increase than we've seen in the euro area, where energy inflation came in at 5.1% in March and then 10.9% in April. In fact, as of March, the latest month for which we have complete data, the US is currently experiencing the highest energy inflation in the G7. Again, this likely reflects the fact that the US economy is more geared around the consumption of fossil fuels than other similarly developed economies, which have thus proved more able to offset the increase in oil and gas prices by leaning on alternative energy sources. This is also the main reason that the US saw the joint highest inflation in the G7 along with the UK that month, with year-on-year CPI coming in at 3.3%, and will probably top the rankings in April, given US inflation came in at 3.8%, while the UK's inflation rate is actually expected to fall to 3%. So you get the idea. The US is surprisingly exposed to the ongoing energy shock, both because inflation was already running pretty hot and because of the American economy's wider reliance on fossil fuels. On to the second part of this video, why the US could be in for a more prolonged inflationary shock. This is basically because of Trump's willingness to exert influence over America's central bank, the Federal Reserve. For context, in most developed countries, the central bank is primarily responsible for taming inflation. Central banks achieve this by raising interest rates, which essentially makes it more expensive to borrow money. This slows the economy down, reducing growth, but also means there's less money circulating in the economy. And if you've got less money chasing the same amount of stuff, this should, in theory, mean lower prices and less inflation. Anyway, in most developed countries, central banks are independent, meaning they're supposed to be essentially insulated from political interference. The theory behind this separation between politics and central banking is that, in short, politicians apparently aren't very good at taming inflation because they don't like raising interest rates and slowing down the economy, especially before an election. Anyway, somewhat unsurprisingly, Trump isn't too committed to the idea of central bank independence and has proven very willing to put pressure on America's central bank, the Federal Reserve, in his campaign for lower interest rates. He has constantly attacked Fed Chair Jerome Powell, labelling him Too Late Powell and launching what looked like a politically motivated investigation into Powell's handling of the renovation of the central bank's Washington headquarters. Powell was able to weather Trump's assault, but is due to be replaced by Trump's nominee Kevin Warsh, who has apparently already promised Trump lower rates sometime in the next few days. The risk here is, with Powell sidelined, Trump is able to basically bully Warsh and the rest of the Fed into cutting interest rates, even if inflation is running hot, to avoid an economic slowdown before the midterms. This could push inflation up even further, with destabilizing impacts for the US economy. Now, you're probably looking to learn more about this story and keep up with how it progresses, and the first place you're going to start is online. But in today's world, it feels like 99% of websites demand your email address just to simply visit the page. So you type in your email to access the site quicker, but unknowingly, you've now put your online safety at risk. Your information can now be sold online, and your email inbox is suddenly cluttered with a bunch of spam you never asked for. Thankfully, we have a solution for you, and that solution is Proton Mail. That's because Proton Mail offers a wide range of features to help keep you safe. From advanced phishing protection that flags potential attacks to keep your inbox safe, to blocking invisible email trackers and preventing companies from spying on you just so they can target you with ads, Proton Mail has it all. They even offer unlimited email aliases to get around these pesky websites that demand your information. They use end-to-end and zero-access encryption, meaning your emails truly stay private, inaccessible to advertisers, trackers, and even Proton itself. That means no ads, no tracking, and no profiling, which feels increasingly uncommon today. Proton also makes switching from your old, cluttered inbox incredibly simple with a migration tool that lets you move everything over in just a few clicks. Or if you prefer, you can start fresh with a brand new email account and enjoy a clean, organised mailbox from day one. So if you want to take back your privacy, start using Proton Mail for free using our link at proton.me/TLDR, and you'll be one step closer to a fully protected online experience free of data exploitation.